Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
And welcome to the show. My name is Chris James. With us tonight is Linda Godfrey. Linda is an author and researcher of the strange and uncanny, and is especially well known as an author of Upright Canaan, known in Wisconsin as the Beast of Bray Road, in Michigan as the Dog Man, in other places as Skinwalker, Werewolf, or dozens of other names. She appeared in the show American Werewolf on the History Channel's Monster Quest, Hunting the American Werewolf, and also she appeared in the show's final 4 episodes. She has traveled about Wisconsin and Michigan looking for strange and offbeat, everything from outside artists and giant roadside statues to local cemetery lore, eccentric people and history, ghost stories and unidentified creatures, as well as UFOs. She put over 5,000 miles on her Weird Mobile and found enough strangeness to fill both Weird Michigan and Weird Wisconsin. What exactly is your Weird Mobile?
Well, that would be my 2006 little kind of beat up car right now. It's a Toyota Corolla, and I had a similar one before that took part of that mileage. But yeah, I've got little bumps and bumps from various of my adventures on it. So It's not like a big, people imagine like the big funny truck on the Ghostbusters. It's nothing like that. No, in fact, I've been made fun of more than once for my little Corolla, but it suits me just fine, gets me where I want to go economically, and so that's what it is.
I see. Well, Linda has appeared on many national TV and radio shows, such as Inside Edition, Discover Kids, Travel Channel, Sci-Fi Channel, the new In Search Of, Coast to Coast AM. Was that with George Norrie or with Art Bell?
I've actually had the privilege to do shows with both of them, and a couple of other people too. It's always a fun show. Mm-hmm. Much as yours is going to prove to be, I'm sure.
Yes, I'm always amazed at how Art Bell was able to do a 5-hour show without any notes, without any support, and yet he filled the whole 5 hours with amazing information.
Yeah, he was unique, that's for sure.
Well, Linda has written a few books: Monsters Among Us, Real Wolfmen, American Monsters, The Beast of Bray Road, A Michigan Dog Man, Hunting the American Werewolf, The Inhumanoids, Weird Michigan, Haunted Wisconsin, Monsters of Wisconsin, just to name a few.
And there's one ringer in there. I don't know how it got on your list. The Inhumanoids. I wish I wrote that book. That's a really great book by my good friend, author, and investigator Bart Nunnally from Kentucky. He also wrote Mysterious Kentucky and a follow-up to that one too. Yeah. But the Inhumanoids is something I'd recommend for everybody interested in the topic. Very, very interesting, chilly, scary kind of book.
Okay. Well, when I interviewed Nick Redfern, I said he had written something like 85 books, and at the time he said it was more like about 35. But that's the internet for you.
Yeah, Nick's another friend of mine. We kind of all tease Nick at how fast he's able just to turn out really great books in a short amount of time. The real king of that is Brad Steiger. I think he's got like 160 or some insane amount of books that he's written over the years. It's just astounding.
Yes, that's an amazing number.
Yeah, and I may be off on that, but I know it's well over 100. So he's another one, but it takes me a little longer, and the books get bigger, and it takes even longer, and the publishers get bigger, and then they take longer to produce the books. So
yes.
I don't see myself competing with either one of those gentlemen for most number of books written, and that's okay.
Well, it was over 25 years ago that you had set out to write a Halloween story, and you were handed the werewolf file. Did you have any kind of a paranormal interest before that day?
Well, it actually was not a Halloween story. It was New Year's Eve weekend when this went down. I heard about it in December of 1991, investigated it for a couple of weeks, and then it landed in the New Year's Eve part of it. And I had, I'll admit to more than a passing interest, but not in cryptozoology. I had not ever thought of anything that looked like a werewolf being around, Walworth County, Wisconsin. But it happened that I was already working with the local animal control officer on another story about puppy mills and some animals being found mutilated, that sort of thing. And he's the one who handed me the file marked werewolf and said people are calling in. And he showed me their names and addresses and gave me their contact information. And that was what started it all. When I went to visit them, they didn't seem crazy to me. They didn't seem like they were trying to hoax or make anything up. I found that the sightings had actually gone back as far as 10 years previously. There was one back in 1981. So it wasn't something that a bunch of people had just cooked up recently. They were all very individual, and the people varied widely, in their demographics too. There were elderly, young people, men, women, blue collar, white collar, you name it. So it intrigued me because I just thought all of these people must have seen something, and whatever it was, I didn't know, but I thought other people would be interested, and that if it were a dangerous animal that happened to be loose somewhere outside of Elkhorn, Wisconsin, which is in the middle of Walworth County, sitting on the Illinois-Wisconsin border, that people had a right to know. It's a fairly populated area, and if I lived out, in one of these places where it had been seen, I would have wanted to be letting my children and pets run loose if it was anything like that. So we wrote the story, and it just took off like a skyrocket. We never thought that would happen, but all of a sudden and it wasn't Halloween. I mean, that's the unusual part. We had moved into January of 1992, and I was getting calls from all over the U.S., and people even in other countries were writing to the newspaper to talk to me, because this was before anybody had much of any sort of internet connection. So they were actually looking up phone numbers and writing me paper letters, which sounds like archaic now, but it indicates the amount of interest. And then the TV stations started coming, and this went on for 10 years before I even, began to think about writing. It was actually 12 years or so before my first book came out, after the initial sightings, during which time I worked at that newspaper and wrote a few short updates, but really not much else. But they kept accumulating to the point where I thought, well, people still have such an interest, and they have a right to know that there were all these other sightings. And so that was my real rationale for the book. I thought I would write one book about it, and it would satisfy everybody's curiosity. And instead, it just started another avalanche of reports, and that's sort of been how it's gone ever since.
Was the first book The Beast of Bray Road?
Well, my first book, and it was with the same publisher, was actually a true historic crime called The Poison Widow, about a woman in southeastern Wisconsin in the 1920s who murdered her husband with strychnine and then tried to kill her 4 children as well. It didn't work out. It was terribly scandalous, and the regional publisher, Trails Media, published it, and then they published The Beast of Bray Road, Tailing Wisconsin's Werewolf, as my second book.
Ah. All this time I thought that The Beast was the first book you'd written. The other was fiction, though?
No, the other was True Historic Crime.
Oh, okay.
True Historic Crime, yeah, and it's really quite a tale, you know, and it's still, people can go to Amazon and find it. Yeah, it's actually pretty shocking and astounding, and had lots of strange coincidences. The interesting thing is, this isn't in that book, but I detailed it in in my Strange Wisconsin. A lot of the places and scenes that were in that original story, you know, which included houses in Whitewater, Wisconsin, and courthouses and things like that, lots of them ended up to have paranormal connections later on, hauntings and things at places where nobody realized they were connected to the Poison Widow. So, yeah, you just never know where these things are going to lead.
Well, I guess I'm going to have to buy that one and read it then. I've already read The Beast of Bray Road and a few others, but...
Oh, thank you.
Did you ever think that simple beginning would lead to such a international werewolf personality for you?
Oh, never. I mean, I remember my editor, I've often said this, my editor and I were talking about the story before it went to press, and we agreed it would be something that local people would have fun with for a couple of weeks, and then it would be just forgotten and, you know, blow over. And boy, were we wrong. You know, and like I said, even during those 10 years, you know, I was doing other things. I was going to grad school for my master's in library education. I already had a degree in art education, and I was teaching art also part-time for a portion of those 10 years, and also was represented by a commercial art rep in Milwaukee. So I was doing a lot of other things, none of which were aimed toward really being known as, you know, the werewolf go-to person. That still hadn't really crossed my mind.
I see. The opening scene in Monsters Among Us, where you're at the Smith farm, which is not the actual location, you ask him about portals. Is this something that comes up often, or is it something you kind of hesitate about asking?
Well, the reason that it does come up, you know, really not just in my work, but in almost anybody who studies these cryptids, you know, Bigfoot or the giant birds or what have you, is that one common denominator they have is that they seem to be able to appear and disappear at will. Not necessarily although occasionally people will report seeing them just sort of wink out, but it's as if they have had another place to step in or out of, you know, which would popularly be known as a portal these days. Some of my Native American friends who have this same idea as a very ancient tradition in their own tribes have told me these creatures belong to what they call the spirit world, and they can come back and forth from there to here. You know, so it's something that seems to come up naturally with these creatures that just do not behave like normal flesh and blood average animals that we run into on a more usual basis.
Mm-hmm. You were talking about the coyote that was caught on the game camera, and it was acting quite nervous. Did the other creature show up at all?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting thing is that and I'll just for your listeners, I'll mention real quick what he's referring to is the person who owned this acreage called the Smith Farm. But actually, it belongs. He's since gone public with his name. Lee Hampel is the name of the owner of that big hay farm. I think it's got like 40 acres of hay, and owns a horse farm. He's a retired physics and math teacher from Chicago, and he had a couple of game cameras out. He was continually putting game cameras there, and then when he'd find a deer carcass that was legal for him to take in Illinois, he'd bring it up there and set it out. And so we had this coyote, and it had come about 9 p.m., and it was there munching. It was a very cold February night, munching on these bones, and every once in a while these shafts of weird light would beam down, and then in the next picture, you'd see the coyote, and he'd be looking up at the light. So it wasn't just something in the camera. The coyote was always reacting to this light. And all of a sudden, just before 3 a.m., it looked extremely alarmed at one of the lights, and then it was gone and didn't show up. Well, the interesting thing is that Lee Hampel then was told by one of the neighbors that his neighbor about half a mile down the road had been sitting out in his shed that same night. It was about 3 a.m., doing some repairs. That's what farmers do. They, have to use their all of their hours to get their work done. And his animals just started going crazy. And so he got up and, ran to the window of the shed and looks out where he's got a view of his lawn and his property. And first thing he sees is this coyote just running like crazy, madly scrambling to get to the woods. It's snow. He's fighting his way through the snow. And then behind him, he said he looked to see if something was chasing it. Behind him was running along this more or less upright. He said it was hunched forward, large fur-covered creature with a dog head and ears, and running on its hind legs and keeping up with and gaining on that coyote. And now this man was somebody who had scoffed at the idea of the Beast of Bray Road. And they are really close to Bray Road, I'll tell you that. They're not exactly on it. They're out in that region. And he has since become a total convert. He said, I can't argue with it anymore because I saw it. So it was pretty amazing. So that's probably the closest we've come to actually getting it on the film. But and it does seem to have some connection with these strange lights. Lee Hampel has literally thousands of game cam photos that were triggered by something, and usually the only thing there that seems to be visible triggering them is, a strange light form or the other. And I experienced one of those strange light forms in person with two other good witnesses up close and personal on that land. So I know that, I don't know if you want to hear about that.
Yes, certainly.
That's in the Monsters Among Us book. And this was after that it had occurred. It's probably like a year and a half ago. And there was a carcass that Lee had out there that nothing was touching. It was really weird because normally we'd get great game photos of, various vultures and coyotes and skunks and raccoons, you name it. Everything comes to eat up those carcasses. Nothing was touching this one for no reason that we could see. So I said, well, why don't we just go do a stakeout in the field and see if there's something scaring things away, from eating it. So we did that, and my friend and colleague Sanjay Singhal was driving, and we were sitting in his car. He and Lee were in the front seat, and I was in the back. I always kind of like to sit in the back seat because I have this big unobstructed view, and I have a feeling anything smart is going to try and sneak up behind me. Anyway, so we were watching. It was on August night. It was very clear. There was supposed to be a meteor shower, so we were kind of looking to see where those might occur. And I saw we were watching an actual line of planes that was a air traffic lane, and one of the planes, quote unquote, suddenly stopped. It was making a slow procession right above the tree line. Suddenly stopped. And it caught my attention, and then it went backwards. It wasn't just oscillating, like a star twinkling or something. It went backwards, and I said, guys, that thing is no plane. And as soon as I said that, they both looked, and as soon as we had all focused our attention on it, it began coming toward us. It left the tree line and began making its way all the way across this 40-acre field. We were just watching it going, oh, my gosh, what is that? Because it was coming closer and closer. And before we knew it, it was 30 feet up in the air, maybe 30 feet from the car at most. It might have been less than that. And we all agreed it was like about the size of a basketball. We all had the feeling that it was watching us. And it was white, and I would say it contained its own, it had light, but it wasn't emitting light. It wasn't like lighting up the woods or the grass around it. And I was just putting my camera up to my face to take a good picture when Sanjay had the inspiration to shine a giant flashlight up at this thing. And he did that, and it just hung there for a moment, and then it just kind of collapsed in upon itself, which shouldn't have been possible. And we were all yelling, and my friend Lee, the retired physics teacher, was yelling, "That's not possible! That's physically not possible!" And it was just we were just amazed because there was no logical explanation for how that could have happened or what that could have been. And when he went out, Sanjay decided to get out of the car and just see if something, maybe there was some sort of airborne thing or, a place of the weird, a place of strange things. There are many other things I could describe. He's had footprints appear in the middle of a snowfield and then walk on two legs into the woods. He's got photos of those. It's just very, very baffling.
How in the book you'd mentioned that your husband had gone with you on some of the investigations. How often does he go with you?
Oh, every once in a while. He's a pretty busy guy. He's a civil engineer. He is quite the sportsman and outdoorsman himself, and I often rely on him for, outdoors type things. But he normally prefers to be fishing or hunting actively, something like that. But sometimes he comes along and he'll often accompany me when I give talks at conventions or conferences or libraries, that kind of thing too. But he's a willing supporter, is how I would put it. He's not actively involved in it. And we have two sons, and neither of them are either.
He doesn't want to get out and go hunting the woods to see if he can track down one of these creatures then.
Well, he likes, he'll go hiking with me, and we'll go with friends sometimes. He enjoys getting out in the woods and hiking, but, he's just usually more keyed into looking for a good buck rub or something like that.
That's like my wife doesn't want to go on ghost hunts or UFO hunts with me, so what can we do?
Yeah, but I have many good friends and colleagues, so I don't believe in doing these things alone.
Do you keep in contact with the folks after you've had a report, an investigation, you've written the book and put it on the shelf? Do you still get contact with these people that have given you reports and do follow-ups?
Oh, yeah, many of them I do. It doesn't always go on forever, but quite often I will talk with people. Some very good friends of mine have long-lasting friends have come out of that sort of situation, and especially when they've had ongoing things, I like to touch base with them and find out if things are still happening. There's, a large percentage of the sightings of both Bigfoot and Dogman are made by people who are either just walking in the woods and happen to see it, or they're driving somewhere and happen to see it. But there's another percentage where these things show up in people's yards, and they just have a real difficult time getting rid of them, and it seems like the actions of the creatures seem to escalate over time. So these people especially, I like to keep in touch with and find out how they're doing, and not that there's a lot that can be done for the situation, but those things do happen.
Oh, yes. In the book you were talking about the Skinwalker Ranch. Could you tell the audience just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I brought that into the book because I call Lee Hampel's place the mini Skinwalker Ranch, because he had, in kind of a microcosm, representatives of almost all the different phenomena that happened at the Skinwalker Ranch. This was a place, and it's still there. I don't think it's quite as active as it was, but it's up in, I think, the northeastern corner of Utah, and was supposedly considered cursed by two of the different Native American peoples or tribes that lived out there. And there are Native American reserves out in that area. And this man who planned to raise cattle on the ranch bought it, moved in with his family, and really weird things started happening. Huge, weird-looking canines would come up almost out of nowhere walk up to them as if friendly and then try and grab a calf out of the calf pen and make off with it. There were very similar weird light phenomena, similar to Lee Hampel's. There were other strange things. There were portals, what they considered portals anyway, because they would see this orange light come into a tree, grow, and then something big and black would go walking away from it. So many of those things, we believe happened at Lee Hampel's ranch as well, and that's why I brought it into the book to kind of compare. Right. So it's a weird place, and like I said, it's not as active as it was, and it was. I'll mention real quickly too. The rancher and his family moved out, within a couple of years, and it was sold to a corporation headed by Robert Bigelow, who has been very active in
paranormal
things, and also in pioneering science applications of different sorts. And he moved a team of very well-educated scientists in all these different fields that you would want to study something like that. Gave them the best equipment, set up monitoring shacks and that sort of thing. And they also experienced these phenomena, but were not able to really, at least as far as we know, capture the final proof on film or video or anything else. So even the best scientists with the best equipment were not able to bring home the goods.
Were you able to draw any kind of a connection between the two ranches, like any similar history, anything like that you could find?
Not really. The geographical locations are really different. One is kind of like desert, mesa, that kind of topography, and then Bray Road up in Wisconsin is very, very wooded areas, although not along that road itself, but lots of fresh water. We're very close to the Great Lakes. It's very green here in the summer. Very different looking places as far as that sort of thing goes. And, I really couldn't find anything relating them. This is one thing that I'm glad you asked that question, because it's one thing that I do try to figure out every time I get a sighting, especially significant ones like that, is I go and look at them both on GPS type maps and on the good old-fashioned atlases, which I can't throw away. I like them just as well. And look for look for things like, are they close to fresh water or salt water? Are they close to certain types of deciduous or coniferous forests? What are the elevations? What type of man-made things are around there? Are there any places held sacred for millennia by Native Americans, or very old graveyards? Are there anything that's of interest and sort of would make you suspicious that weird things might happen there. Even things like crossroads or roadsides, which I noticed were places that in the British Isles that these black phantom dogs and things like that were often appearing at crossroads and in churchyards. And I did find a correlation with that as well. But not between these two that I could see. It's just that they had the same kind of thing where there were large animals that predators might want, and then weird things started happening.
That's incredible. As far as I know, we don't have anything like that down here in Laredo, but you never know.
Yeah, and sometimes these places exist for years, and people don't talk about them.
Oh, yes.
That happens very often. Oftentimes, people will realize there's weird stuff and they want to sell the house, and they don't want it known as a haunted place, and so they don't say anything, and then that repeats itself with the next owners. That can go on for, year after year.
Yes, it can. The Torrance, California werewolf sighting. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, it's in the Los Angeles area, the greater Los Angeles area, and near Torrance, and this was sent to me by a young woman who had This incident happened when she was a child in grade school, and she had never been able to shake herself free from the fear. And you'll understand when I explain. Her mother was going to a laundromat, and the kids, she and her brother, had just gotten a new ball, and they were out in the back alley behind the laundromat just playing with the ball. And she said all of a sudden there was this, like a sewer cover in the asphalt by that parking lot, and the ball had gone over that way, and she went to get it, and there was a man walking or coming up out of the sewer, kind of standing on a ladder, and she thought he was dressed kind of weirdly. He had a shirt that was sort of, she said the sleeves are sort of puffed out like an old-fashioned pirate shirt or something, and that he beckoned her to come over by him, and she went a little closer and could see that he was standing on kind of a ladder or narrow stairs that went down into a subterranean room of some kind, and he called her by name, and that made her very wary because her brother hadn't used her name, and yet this guy was trying to get her over to him. And at that point, she said she looked at him, and he started changing right in front of her. Now, this is something that I've always said I did not really believe happened. And maybe there are other causes for it. I still don't think that body to body, a man to a werewolf, there's no change where all your atoms and your corpuscles and your DNA and everything switches and completely rebuilds itself in a matter of moments, and then boom, you're this animal. I think there are delusions that certain medicine people are able to project, and that's a big topic and would take me a longer time than this to explain it. But as far as just, the Lon Chaney type of werewolf where they're sprouting the whiskers and the jaws changing and they're growing teeth, I mean, that alone would be an impossible thing. So she's seeing this guy do that, and he seemed to be upset that it was happening and went back down under the subterranean chamber, and she and her brother ran into the laundromat, and their mother was impressed enough with their story that she changed laundromats and never went back there. But it's interesting because she described the hatch that he was lifting up as like square. And I mentioned my husband is a civil engineer, and he specializes in wastewater treatment, so he knows his manholes. And I said, could there be such a thing as a square type of hatch, that over some kind of system? And he said, oh yes, that's the blah blah blah. I can't remember what the exact terminology was, but normally manholes are round on most streets because it's the shape that you can put a little ledge in around it and then it won't fall in among itself. Any other shape, if you turn it the wrong way, it can fall down into the pipes or whatever below. So he said, yes, there is a type, and it's the type that would normally be used in a parking lot where they've got utilities that need to be reached. And of course, in that part of California, very few places have basements. So they need some kind of underground. And here's this little girl. She didn't understand anything about manholes, but she was describing correctly what would have been there. So it's a pretty interesting story.
Then the creature goes and telepathically is communicating with her, which is, once again, a very strange occurrence. Right.
Although that one aspect is the one thing that very frequently, more frequently than you might think, occurs even to people who just slow down as they're passing one on a roadside. It's sitting by the roadside eating, a deer carcass, or it's standing there or running on its hind legs, and it will look at them. They'll have eye contact, and they'll say, and it's usually the very last thing that an eyewitness tells me when they're describing their encounter, they'll say, there's one more thing. I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I might as well tell you, I felt like it was giving me this message, like it was better than me, or it was superior to me, or if it wanted to, it could jump on my car. Or another one was, if I told anyone that it would come and get me, and they'll say it's not like we were hearing a voice in their head or hearing it in English. This was the impression that they felt it was trying to convey to them somehow. And so that is the one, because normally just merely walking on the hind legs is not a supernatural act.
No.
Almost any mammal of any kind can be trained to do that, at least for a short period of space, by some type of motivation. And when animals have injured forelimbs in the wild, they will by necessity get around on their hind legs because it's the only way they can, move and try and find some food or whatever. So, but the mental thing is unusual because you don't hear people say anything like that when they meet up with another kind of predator. I mean, imagine, you're hunting and you see a bear. Would you think that the bear was telling you, "I'm better than you. I could come and jump on you if I wanted to"? You realize it's a different thing. It doesn't make any sense in that context.
Quite true. You also mentioned the VIP werewolf that sounded pretty much like a dog man than a werewolf. Could you go over that a little bit?
No, I'm sorry. I'm kind of trying to remember which. Can you give me a little more?
A woman you knew was driving, and she had the window down on her car, and a limousine pulls up alongside her.
Oh, yes. This was actually the wife of the late Philip K. Dick, the very famous science fiction writer, who has all kinds of TV shows coming out recently based on his work. And this was some years ago, she was taking classes at some college and pulled up to a stoplight. She was in a convertible. She looks over and there's a black limo pulls up right next to her with tinted windows. And she looks over and the window starts rolling down. And sitting there is what she at first just thought it looked like a German Shepherd, a beautiful, just nicely groomed, large German Shepherd sitting in sitting in one of the back passenger areas, just looking at her. And then she said, as she looked, because she was thinking, well, what a beautifully dog. He's kind of weird. It very, very deliberately lifted one arm, and I'm going to say arm, and put what should have been a paw, but was more like a hand, on the door where the window had rolled down, and just looked at her. And then she knew that it was something else. It was not just a dog. It wasn't a human. It wasn't anybody in a dog suit. And of course, she never forgot that.
Mm-hmm. If this had been a hoax, which it would have had to have been an elaborate one,
mm-hmm.
you would think the guy that pulled it would do it again because people like that don't do it just once. But there were no other reports of anyone else seeing anything like that.
Not that I know of. No, not at all. And she didn't hear of any either. So, and yeah, it would have been very hard. And I mean, this was probably, I'm thinking 20, 30 years ago. I don't have the book in front of me, so I may be wrong on those numbers. But it was a while ago when it would have been difficult to have a costume that could have fooled someone from a distance of a few feet like that in daylight. She had a very good look at it. Mm-hmm. It was right there. And if you've got a living, breathing animal, I mean, imagine, your own pet dog. You're looking at it from a few feet away and you're thinking, oh, well, that could be a human inside there. No, you don't think that because you can tell, you can see where the muscles are. You can tell the teeth are different, that it's got the protruding muzzle. Very, very hard to fake in daylight at close range.
Oh, yes.
If not impossible.
What percentage of sightings of dogmen were wearing clothing as opposed to just simply covered with hair?
It's quite a small percentage. It does not happen very often, but it does happen. And if you go back to the late, great John Keel, who was very well known, probably best known for his investigation of Mothman, Point Pleasant. He noted a few places in some of his books that occasionally one of these types of creatures would be seen wearing at least a shred of clothing of some kind, and that often if there was a shirt, it was plaid. And he didn't know what the relationship of that plaid shirt was, but I've seen that too. But again, in California, as a matter of fact, there was a woman who she and her boyfriend both saw what they thought was a very large human jogging in a public park, and as it jogged toward them, they realized it was a very large wolf-like creature wearing a jogging suit, which, and many of the times when these are reported, especially if the clothing covers a large portion of the body, I'm inclined to think perhaps this was a hoaxer with a very good mask or something like that. Although in this particular case, she said it went to make a turn, and instead of going down the path like most people would, it took a huge flying leap and easily cleared this bench, this big stone bench that was sitting there, which kind of astonished her, and then just landed as if nothing, had happened, and kept running toward wherever it was going. But, there are a lot of problems with this, because let's say that these things are just natural animals that have learned to run on their hind legs or whatever, and they've got paws with claws. And almost all of them are described, even if they say they actually had hands, they still have claws. Have you ever tried to button up a shirt with razor-shaped claws on, trying to handle the buttons? I don't think that's going to happen. And if they aren't, corpuscle and DNA changing, flesh and blood to flesh and blood transformation creatures, how are they going to have clothing on them? You assume that if there was such a thing, that's another thing that makes me a little suspicious of some of these ones with clothing, because it's just too easy to hide the rest of the body.
It would make
you're doing that.
It would make hoaxing that much easier, because all you need is the dog head.
Right. I mean, if you, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say the shredded clothing would be what you'd believe would be there if it were something that tried to dress itself with claws, or if it did really truly change. I'm not sure if I made my point that well.
Yes.
Well, if it really truly did change and grew, and then all the buttons popped off and everything just shredded, just like in the movies. But those are really rare. I mean, I'd say, maybe 1% to 2% of reports. Mm-hmm. So I don't put a lot of stock in forming general theory with them.
You mentioned the tunnels under Los Angeles. Any indication how many sightings might have been associated with the tunnels?
Well, it's hard to say. All big cities pretty much have a large web of tunnels and networks underground that most people don't realize. Many of them were created for no longer used underground subways. A lot of them were from they were put down there to service the huge steam rooms that were needed, steam plants, when everything was heated by steam. During the Prohibition, people would add tunnels so that they could have easy access to their speakeasies, get around that way. Just lots of reasons. You talk about abandoned sewage drainage places. So most cities, not even just the big ones, but many of the smaller ones too, are literally honeycombed with these areas. Most of them are closed off to the public, but other things can still get around in there. And I don't know if you've been following for the past maybe at least half a year or so, people have been reporting these flying Mothman-looking things over Chicago. And, a lot of the theory, I don't know if they're real or a hoax or what, but a lot of the theory has been that maybe they do live in some of these types of subterranean chambers under Chicago, and it is true. I did actually have one, not the best report, but it was kind of short and it was secondhand, but from some type of law enforcement official who was repeatedly hearing that there were things that looked like werewolves in the sewers of Minot, North Dakota. Mm-hmm. So, the reports come in, and you just I try and make associations where I can, investigate till I hit a dead wall, and that's basically all I can do in many cases.
Yes. The church lady monster, Now, that was an incredible story. Could you take us through that event?
Yeah, this is probably one of the most amazing stories, if not the most, in Monsters Among Us. And it was such an incredible story. I want people to know that I took extra care in vetting the witnesses, which were a family of four, a mom, a dad, and then there was a teenage girl and a slightly younger boy. And I met with them at least 3 times in person. I took my husband along a couple of times, just, for a second opinion and reaction. And they never changed. He was a decorated Vietnam veteran, just salt of the earth type, middle-aged people. No reason to, want to put one over on anybody. They didn't want fame or glory. They didn't want to be known, their real names or anything like that. But there was a church somewhere in northern Illinois. I did promise I wouldn't give the exact town, although the church is no longer there. It was literally partly taken down and partly consumed by another building. But they're sitting in church, and the pews are all arranged in like a horseshoe formation. So if you're in the front pew, you're kind of facing whoever's at the other end of that pew. And they were sitting there. It was one Sunday morning, and a lady they didn't know very well. She was rather recent to the church. And this is a conservative, little, very Bible-based sort of denomination. And they noticed she didn't look real well. She had sort of a grayish cast to her skin, and the dad was wondering if she'd had cancer or something, and just nondescript, kind of dark hair, had like a dark skirt and a white blouse, nothing you'd really remember. And the pastor finished his sermon, and usually what happened then was he would take his Bible and walk down from the podium, join his family, and then they would have a music portion of the service. Well, just as he took his Bible and was passing that first pew, that woman jumped to her feet, let out this horrendously just ear-piercing howl, and she appeared to do exactly what I've been saying. I'm not sure it could happen, but it wasn't like the flesh and blood transformations that, from Hollywood. Within a matter of a second or two, she went from being this ordinary-looking woman to a rather large, gray-furred, wolf-like creature with rear paws and maybe its front too, but for sure the rear ones. I don't have it in front of me. And there it was, this creature, just standing howling in front of them, where this woman had been. Now, because a lot of the people were had their faces down in their hymnals, trying to find the first page and everything. Not everybody looked up there, but the howl was reverberating throughout the church, and so people were kind of looking around and going, "Did you hear that? What was that?" Well, because it was the time when the pastor moved down from the church, there were several elders up in front too, because then they were going to follow the pastor down, and they immediately tackled this creature down onto the pew. And within seconds, again, it was transformed back into that woman. And the husband and wife said there was no trace of the wolf-like creature. When it was the wolf-like creature, there was no trace of her. And again, my best guess is that this was some type of a projection made either through a type of special religious training that often occurs in nature-based religions, or some sort of dark, magical, occult type of rites. And that the woman would have been believed to have been somehow, associated with one of these things. Because, again, there was no torturous, bone-cracking, teeth-growing, anything like that. It was just 1 second she's this woman, the next minute she's this creature, and then once she's tackled, immediately she's that woman again. And they let her out of the church, just kind of supported her. She didn't seem to really know what had happened. And they said there normally was a video of every sermon so that it could be sent to shut-ins and that sort of thing. And they tried to get a copy of the video, but they were told it was taken away or didn't exist or something. And the woman was also taken away somewhere. But came back eventually.
Kind of makes you wonder what was going on, that more than one person sees this. It's broad daylight, and it's not the kind of thing you can recreate with Hollywood technology because it's in a church.
Right, and also nobody could get a costume on and off that fast. On, off, and then it's none of it. And I had them sign an affidavit saying that it was everything they said was true. Any sort of corollary facts that they gave me, I went and checked out. Every single thing that they said checked out down to the last, dime and nickel. So I could find no fault between them. I had the husband drew a really nice sketch of it, which is in that book, so you can get a good idea of what they saw. And the kids, the teenage girl, she said the mom said she remembered her asking, "Mom, what was that?" And they tried to tell the kids that it was some strange dog that came into the church. And she said she remembers her daughter going, "Oh, please, Mom, I know it wasn't that." So the kids knew it was an unusual thing, too.
That is definitely a weird story, one of many throughout the book. And I highly recommend anyone that hasn't read it yet, run out and get a copy because it is filled with stories just like that.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's The Monsters Among Us. That's my most recently published. I have another one in the production works right now at the publishers. So,
can you give us the name?
I'm not supposed to release the name because it's not totally. It takes those publishers. This is Penguin Random House, and they have big teams of editors and artists and things, and they don't have the final title nailed down yet, so they prefer I didn't give out a wrong one. Yeah, so I defer to it. But it's actually more along these lines because it seems whatever I write begets more of whatever that is, and that happened in this case too.
You talked about Anubis sightings. Could these have been Dogman sightings that the witness was just a little bit mistaken? Since Anubis, it was a jackal, and a jackal is a form of dog.
Right. And, nobody said that, and this happens every once in a while, that someone will say that the creature reminded me of that Egyptian Anubis. And they don't mean that they believe it was Anubis. And usually they'll say, well, it did have the long pointed muzzle. Most of the time it's when the dog or the upright wolf or whatever it is has a glossy short coat of black fur and very tall stand-up ears, and they'll say that it reminded them of Anubis. So it's more or less. And there are, Doberman pinschers look kind of like that. There are certain, you could mix dogs for hybrids to probably get one that looked almost exactly like it, I would imagine. But it's more of a comparison than them saying, well, I believe that's what it was.
Now, how about the young girl from Louisiana that had found something in the backyard that brought on a Dogman encounter? And could you tell the audience about that one?
Yeah, that was a young girl she had some Native American heritage, and they had a house where they were digging in the backyard. I think they were trying to dig up soil for a garden, and they came across some buried artifacts and just some common little items that you might find in any such site. And she took a couple of them home and actually had one of these great dark creatures appear in her room and look at her. And she felt like, it knows that I took these things. I better put them back. And I believe this was in the chapter called Bedroom Invaders, because there's a certain class of sightings that the subjects are definitely not the same thing that people see walking along the roadway or, just running in the woods. Because we know that this particular type that appears in people's bedrooms almost has to be by definition some sort of phantom, because how did they get in and out, without opening doors or windows or anything? It's like they appear in the room and then they disappear. And they're more prevalent than people might think, but it's not the same sort of thing. And it's interesting, and that brings up another thing. I said right from my very first book, many books ago, The Beast of Bray Road, that after looking at all the different types of sightings, I could tell already that probably not everyone who reported seeing some sort of upright canine was seeing the exact same phenomenon, because you had these ones that were things that could well have been, a dog with hurt paws that was walking on its hind legs. It didn't do anything that wasn't natural. And then you had other types there's another type that looks huge, really huge, and is very fierce and much more aggressive than a lot of the others. There are some that walk on four legs, but they're easily recognized as being something unusual because they're the size of a small dairy calf or a Shetland pony, something like that, and they make a different sort of contact. And then you have these ones that act like the Black Phantom dogs of Great Britain. And and then there are the Skinwalkers, which are the shaman that change their shapes. Shapeshifters might be another way to put it. And they're usually identifiable by having more human parts to them. They're the ones that may be more likely to have clothing on, which kind of makes sense. And they're projecting this, image of a different animal. So it's not like there's one final answer in my view. I think that there are different types of phenomena that are displaying as upright canines, and depending on the situation, that's why you just really have to look at the situation and especially the sacred grounds. If there's something different about the creature, they're often guarding some sort of sacred area.
How about Darla and her California bad dreaming? That was probably the creepiest story in the entire book.
Yeah, and I know the one that you mean. And excuse me, just 1 second here. I'm going to have to grab my book here, because I think I have like 18 published books, and I start mixing up just the name, and some of the names are changed, so I don't remember. So you're going to have to give me just a little bit to make sure I've got the right one here.
She was in California, and they stayed in a house out in the country, and she kept seeing this creature that looked like a dog, upright dog. She saw it when she was young, and then as she got a little older, she saw it again.
Right, that was one of those habituation situations that I was telling you about before. Yeah, and if I'm correct, this was the one where it kept kind of getting closer and closer to the house when it would appear.
Yes.
And the scary thing was that it seemed it was attempting to lure various members of her household out into the yard at night. And she found herself just almost as if she were sleepwalking, leaving the house and walking out there, and kind of came to and just barely made it back up on the porch. And another time, she went out, she saw her brother out by the tree line, and she thought, oh, that's not a good place for him to be. And she goes out there, gets halfway there, she stopped for some reason to turn and look at the house, and then she realized her brother was in the house. She could see him through the window. And she turned back around, and the creature was starting to kind of slouch away. But again, she ran, back up to the house. So, yeah, that's, again, one of those situations where these things seem to glom onto a particular group of people or family, and for whatever purposes. But, it's not, I've had situations described in other of the books where it was doing the same thing. So, and usually there's one person who's a particular focus.
It kind of makes you wonder what is going on here besides just some kind of a cryptid sighting.
Right, exactly.
There's probably something more to it that we haven't figured out yet.
Right, yeah, and with these habituation situations, I should mention, very similar to what happens with Bigfoot, people have reported saying that when they feel that it's chasing them or it's close or whatever, they've just out of pure fear cried out to God or to Jesus to save them, and they turn around and it's gone. And the other thing that they do, and I'm not making a pitch for any religion, I'm just saying what witnesses have told me, even if they didn't consider themselves very strong believers or anything. The other thing that sometimes helps is they will have a priest or clergyman from whatever belief system they have to come and do some sort of prayer or cleansing ceremony. That sometimes helps. What I usually recommend is that they invest as much as they can afford in yard lights, spotlights, particularly motion sensitive or remote control, that they can just suddenly flood the yard with light. And whatever these things are, they don't like to come in a real lighted area. And that usually is the most effective, especially if there's always a motion sensor, flaring up in their face. They don't want to come near those things. Also, or any electronics. I mean, they don't like game cameras. I've learned that firsthand, and will avoid electronic type of things. So those, you wish that you had something more foolproof to offer to people, but those usually are the ones that seem most effective for people.
What do you do when you're not looking for dogman or werewolves? Hobbies?
Yeah, it's gotten to the point where I'm an artist. I, have shown in some museums and had an art rep and that sort of thing. And I do illustrate my books wherever I can. So a lot of the time I'm making art, I'm doing research, taking trips to research, giving talks and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of associated activities that go along with it. But I still like to make my other artwork. I have a good-sized family. I have grandsons to enjoy. So, it's not like I have absolutely no other life. I like to do other things. And sometimes I just like to go for walks out in the woods, That's usually when things happen. I have had experiences and sightings myself, and it's always when I intend nothing but a little walk for enjoyment and don't even have a cell phone or a camera with me. Those are the only times that this happens.
Are there any... Go ahead.
Just in my own experiences.
Are there any upcoming conferences or events people can attend where you'll be there live?
Yeah, there are several coming up. I'm going to have those posted on my website. If I don't think that I did that yet. I'm a little behind from having just finished my book deadline, but I'm going to be the weekend of June 8th and 9th. I will be up on the border of Wisconsin and the UP. I'm going to be in August. And I'm very sorry, I don't have these dates right in front of me. But again, you can go and look. I'll be at the Michigan Paracon in Sault Ste. Marie, which is, I think, the second weekend in August. I'm going to be in Frankfort, Kentucky, at CryptidCon in September. And there's one more coming. Oh, I'm going to be in Grand Haven, Michigan, coming up in June, I believe. So there'll be some, but that you can find anything you want about my books or me. There are a bunch of different pages you can go to at lindagodfrey.com. You don't need the W's or anything like that. It's my blog, and you can also find stories that are not in the books there. In fact, I have 2 ready to load into my blog very soon. So if you go now and don't see them, come back in a couple of days. 2 that happened in Michigan, southwestern Michigan, both unknown to one another, at about the same time frame, within a year of one another. So that's always kind of interesting when that happens. And they came to me the reports came from very separate people, unknown to one another, in the same week. So I'll be posting those.
Can people get all your books there at the website as well?
Yeah, there's a books and bio page you can click on, and you'll find a list of my books, and where you can click on to find them, and lots of other stuff. Too much to even mention, and no ads. I don't put ads on my blog.
Well, this has been a fantastic hour. I appreciate you coming on the show, and hopefully I can get you back sometime soon.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I'd love to come back anytime.
And thank you very much. That was Linda Godfrey from Wisconsin. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?